decades. 48 dangerously unhinged muscle cars. From the 1960s to the 1990s, these are the machines that pushed speed and sanity to the limit. The 1960s were the decade that gave birth to the American muscle car, a time when horsepower was cheap, gasoline cost pennies per gallon, and safety regulations were something engineers laughed about over lunch. Detroit was locked in an arms race where cubic inches and quarter-mile times were the only currencies that mattered. The result was a collection of machines so powerful, so primitive, and so willing to kill their drivers that they defined an entire generation's relationship with speed and danger. These weren't transportation. They were weapons disguised as automobiles, built in an era when survival depended entirely on skill, courage, and luck. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1960s. The machines that proved American engineers could build anything, even if nobody could actually drive it safely. Number 12, the 1967 Pontiac Firebird 400. Pontiac's answer to the Mustang arrived late to the pony car party, but it made an impression. The Firebird 400 took GM's mid-size muscle car engine and crammed it into a compact platform that was never designed to handle that much power. The 6.6-liter V8 made 325 horsepower and 410 pound-feet of torque, which doesn't sound apocalyptic by today's standards. But in a car that weighed around 3,300 pounds with primitive bias-ply tires and no electronic aids, it was more than enough to get you into serious trouble. The Firebird could hit 60 miles per hour in around 6.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-14-second range. What made it dangerous was the chassis. GM had designed the F-body platform for handling with smaller engines, and the suspension geometry simply wasn't optimized for the weight and power of the 400. The front end was nose-heavy, which caused severe understeer when entering corners. But lift off the throttle mid-corner to try to tighten your line, and suddenly, all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be in a drift, whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick for the era. Just over 3 turns lock to lock, but it lacked feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing until they were already sliding. The brakes were drums all around on base models, which meant stopping distances were measured in optimism rather than feet. Even with the optional front disc brakes, fade set in quickly during aggressive driving. The Firebird 400 taught thousands of young drivers that looking fast and being controllable weren't the same thing. It was a car that invited you to drive aggressively with its aggressive styling and powerful engine, then punished you for accepting that invitation. Number 11, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 383. Dodge took their compact Dart platform and stuffed it full of big block power, creating one of the most ill-mannered muscle cars of the 60s. The 383 cubic inch V8 made 330 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque, installed in a car that weighed barely 3,200 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio was impressive, and the performance numbers reflected it. The Dart GTS could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But the chassis was completely overwhelmed. The Dart was built on Chrysler's A-body platform, which was designed for economy cars with 6-cylinder engines. The suspension had minimal travel, the shock absorbers were undersized, and the frame rails weren't reinforced to handle the twisting forces of big block torque. The result was a car that would literally twist its body under hard acceleration. Panel gaps would change, doors would become difficult to open, and the whole structure would flex like it was trying to fold itself in half. The front suspension geometry was primitive, with torsion bars that allowed the nose to dive dramatically under braking. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem. Launch hard and the rear axle would wind up the leaf springs like a torsion bar. When the tires finally broke loose, all that stored energy would release at once, causing the rear end to hop and skip violently. The steering was slow and vague, which made precise control impossible. And the brakes were marginal at best, drums all around unless you ordered the expensive front disc option. The Dart GTS proved that putting a big engine in a small car created performance, but not necessarily drivability. It was a car that could accelerate like a rocket, but steered like a shopping cart and stopped like an oil tanker. The weight distribution was also problematic, with the heavy big block sitting far forward in the chassis. That made the car nose-heavy and prone to plowing straight ahead in corners, no matter how much you turned the steering wheel. Number 10, the 1969 Ford Torino Cobra 429. Ford's midsize muscle car entry was built to compete with the Chevelle and GTO, and they didn't hold back. The Torino Cobra came standard with Ford's 429 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8, which officially made 375 horsepower. But like all Ford big block ratings of the era, that number was pure fiction. Real output was closer to 450 horses, with torque numbers exceeding 500 pound-feet. The Cobra could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were serious numbers that put it in the same performance league as cars, costing much more. But the Torino's size and weight made it a handful. At over 3,800 pounds, this was a heavy car with serious momentum. The long hood and short deck proportions meant forward visibility was compromised, especially during hard acceleration when the front end would lift. The chassis was typical Ford, body-on-frame construction with a solid rear axle and leaf springs. The suspension was tuned more for ride comfort than handling precision, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. Turn the steering wheel, and the car would lean heavily to the outside before the front tires actually started changing direction. The delay between input and response made precise driving impossible, and the rear suspension had a tendency to allow axle wrap during hard acceleration. The leaf springs would wind up as torque tried to rotate the axle, and when the tires finally broke loose, the springs would unwind violently, causing wheel hop that could break rear axle components. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was better than many competitors, but they still weren't up to the task of repeatedly hauling this nearly 2-ton beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few hard applications. The Torino Cobra was a car that felt stable and planted at cruising speeds, which gave drivers false confidence. Then, they'd push hard and discover that stability disappeared the moment you asked for maximum performance. The body-on-frame construction also meant the chassis would flex and twist under hard use, with the body separating slightly from the frame. You could hear creaks and groans during aggressive cornering as the structure worked against itself. Number 9. The 1967 Chevrolet Camaro SS 396. Chevrolet's pony car response to the Mustang came equipped with genuine big block power and SS trim. The 396 cubic inch V8 made 325 horsepower in base form, but the L78 version with the higher compression ratio and better breathing components made 375 horses. That was enough to make the 3,300-pound Camaro genuinely quick. Quarter-mile times came in the mid-13s, and 60 miles per hour arrived in under 6 seconds. But the first-generation Camaro had quirks that made it dangerous in inexperienced hands. The unibody construction was less rigid than body-on-frame competitors, which meant the chassis would flex under hard cornering or acceleration. You could actually see the cowl twist if you watched carefully during a hard launch. The front suspension used coil springs and unequal length control arms, which was sophisticated for the era. But the geometry wasn't optimized for big block weight, and the front end would plow in tight corners. The rear suspension was a multi-leaf spring setup with a solid axle, and it had a nasty habit of causing the rear end to step out suddenly when you hit a bump mid-corner. The steering was recirculating ball type, which meant it was vague and slow compared to modern rack and pinion systems. You needed nearly 4 full turns to go from lock to lock, and there was significant play in the center position. That made small corrections difficult and large corrections slow. The brakes were optional front discs with rear drums, which was adequate for normal driving but marginal during sustained hard use. The weight distribution was nose-heavy because of that big block engine sitting far forward in the chassis, which meant the front brakes did most of the work. They would fade quickly during aggressive driving, leaving you with rear drums that locked up easily and sent the car spinning. The Camaro SS was a car that looked fantastic, sounded menacing, and went like hell in a straight line. But ask it to turn or stop at speed, and it revealed its limitations quickly. The combination of unibody flex, primitive suspension, and marginal brakes made it a car that demanded respect and skill from its driver. Number 8. The 1969 Mercury Cougar Eliminator 428 Cobra Jet. Mercury's upscale pony car got the full performance treatment with the Eliminator package, and the results were spectacular and terrifying in equal measure. The 428 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8 made 335 horsepower officially, but that was the same engine Ford rated at 335 in everything from Mustangs to Torinos, regardless of actual output. Real power was closer to 400 horses, with torque exceeding 440 pound-feet. The Cougar Eliminator could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in just over 6 seconds. But the Cougar was heavier than the Mustang it was based on, tipping the scales at nearly 3,500 pounds. And that weight came with consequences. The longer wheelbase, 111 inches compared to the Mustang's 108, provided better straight-line stability but made the car feel larger and less agile. The hideaway headlights added weight to the nose, making the front-heavy weight distribution even worse. Mercury marketed the Cougar as a more sophisticated alternative to the Mustang, with a plusher interior and more sound deadening. But all that luxury equipment added weight and dulled the car's responses. The suspension was tuned for a comfortable ride, which meant it wallowed in corners. The steering was slow and overboosted, giving little feedback about what the front tires were doing. And the brakes, while adequate for casual driving, would fade quickly during hard use. The Eliminator package added stiffer springs and shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic physics of a nose-heavy rear-drive car with a solid rear axle and marginal tires. What made the Cougar Eliminator particularly dangerous was that it attracted buyers who wanted performance but also valued comfort and luxury. These weren't hardcore enthusiasts who understood the car's limits. They were people who wanted to look fast and occasionally drive fast, without necessarily having the skills to handle a 400 horsepower rear-drive muscle car. The combination of serious power, comfort-oriented chassis tuning, and inexperienced drivers led to a lot of crashed Cougars. Number 7. The 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner. Plymouth's budget muscle car was designed to deliver maximum performance for minimum money, and it succeeded brilliantly. But it also created one of the most dangerous muscle cars of the era, precisely because it made so much power available to so many young, inexperienced drivers. The base engine was the 383 cubic inch V8, making 335 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. That was enough to propel the 3,500-pound Roadrunner through the quarter mile in the mid-14s. But the real danger came with the optional 440 cubic inch engine, which made 375 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. With that engine, the Roadrunner could run low 14 and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. The problem was that Plymouth stripped the car of everything that didn't make it faster to keep the price down. That meant vinyl seats instead of cloth, rubber floor mats instead of carpet, and most importantly, the cheapest suspension and brakes they could get away with. The front suspension was basic torsion bars with minimal damping. The rear was leaf springs and a solid axle with shocks that were more suggestion than control. The steering was manual unless you paid extra for power assist, which meant it was heavy and slow. And the brakes were drums all around in base form, which meant stopping distances that would be considered criminal today. The Roadrunner was also offered with a 4-speed manual transmission that had widely spaced gears. First gear was extremely low for hard launches, but the jump to second was huge. That meant you had to rev the engine near redline in first, then drop several thousand RPM when shifting to second. If you weren't smooth with the clutch, the rear end would break loose violently during the 1-2 shift, sending inexperienced drivers spinning. Plymouth sold over 44,000 Roadrunners in 1968 alone, which meant these dangerous machines were everywhere. Young buyers could afford them. Insurance companies hadn't figured out how to price them properly yet, and the performance was intoxicating. The combination led to a lot of accidents, a lot of deaths, and eventually to the insurance industry crackdown that helped kill the muscle car era. The Roadrunner became a symbol of accessible performance, but it also became a cautionary tale about making too much power available to drivers who lacked the experience to handle it safely. Number 6. The 1969 Dodge Charger RT Hemi. Dodge's fastback muscle car was beautiful, powerful, and absolutely lethal in the wrong hands. The Charger RT with the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 represented the pinnacle of Mopar muscle, and it came with all the danger that implied. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque officially, but everyone knew those numbers were conservative. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the torque was even more underrated. The Charger Hemi could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 5.5 seconds. Those were supercar numbers in 1969, achieved with an engine that was essentially a race motor with street manners. But the Charger was a big car, over 208 inches long and weighing nearly 3,800 pounds. That size meant it had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The long hood, over 6 feet from bumper to windshield, meant forward visibility was compromised. You couldn't see the front corners of the car, which made parking difficult and low-speed maneuvering hazardous. The unibody construction was stiffer than body-on-frame cars, but it still flexed under the twisting forces of hard acceleration or aggressive cornering. The doors would become difficult to open after hard use, and panel gaps would change as the structure twisted. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was common during hard launches. The Hemi's power delivery made this worse. The engine was docile below 3,000 RPM, then violent above it. There was no gentle transition, just an on-off switch. Below 3,000, you had a heavy, lazy engine that barely made power. Above 3,000, you had 500 horsepower trying to tear the rear axle out of the car. That sudden power delivery meant the rear tires would break loose violently when the engine came on the cam, and if you weren't ready for it, you'd be sideways before you could react. The steering was recirculating ball type, with lots of play and little feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing, which made precise driving impossible. And the brakes, while better than many competitors with standard front discs and rear drums, still weren't up to the task of repeatedly stopping this nearly 2-ton car from triple-digit speeds. The Charger Hemi was a car that made you feel invincible. The styling was aggressive, the sound was menacing, and the acceleration was intoxicating. But it demanded respect and skill, and it punished drivers who had more enthusiasm than ability. The combination of massive power, primitive chassis dynamics, and the Charger's widespread popularity meant these cars were involved in countless accidents throughout the late 60s and early 70s. Number 5. The 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. The L88. Corvette wasn't just dangerous, it was barely street legal. Chevrolet built it for racing, but they had to sell a certain number to qualify for competition homologation. So they created what was essentially a race car with headlights and sold it to anyone with enough money and courage. The 7.0-liter V8 was officially rated at 430 horsepower, but that was a lie so blatant it was almost insulting. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The L88 could run the quarter mile in the low 12s and hit 60 in under 4 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, and this was 1967. But everything about the L88 was compromised for racing. The compression ratio was 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel. Run pump gas and the engine would destroy itself through detonation. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely ran below 3,000 RPM. The idle was so rough that parts would vibrate loose if you didn't safety wire everything. And there was no heater, no radio, no sound deadening. Nothing that didn't make the car faster. The chassis couldn't handle the power. The C2 Corvette's independent rear suspension was sophisticated for the era, but it used a single transverse leaf spring that allowed the rear wheels to tuck under the body during hard cornering. That sudden camber change would cause the rear end to break loose without warning. The front suspension wasn't much better, with geometry that caused severe understeer at the limit. The brakes were four-wheel discs, which was excellent for the era, but they were designed for the base 327 cubic inch engine, not the monster L88. They would overheat quickly during hard use, and fade was a constant problem. The steering was quick but not communicative, which meant you were always guessing at the limits of traction. Chevrolet only sold 20 L88 Corvettes in 1967, and most went directly to race teams who knew what they were getting into. But a few ended up with wealthy enthusiasts who discovered they'd bought a car that was completely undrivable on the street and terrifying at the track. Number 4, the 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4. Pontiac's wildest GTO combined outrageous styling with genuine performance credentials. The Judge package added bold graphics, a rear wing, and the Ram Air 4 engine option, a 400 cubic inch V8 that made 370 horsepower officially, but over 400 in reality. The Ram Air 4 was built for top-end power, with round port cylinder heads that flowed massive amounts of air and a camshaft with aggressive timing. The result was an engine that made most of its power between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM. Below that range, it was sluggish and lazy. Above it, it was a monster. The GTO Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds. But the power delivery made it tricky to drive. You had to keep the engine in its narrow power band, which required precise shifting and careful throttle modulation. Drop below 4,000 RPM and you'd fall out of the power band, losing momentum. Over-rev past 6,000 and you'd risk damage to the valve train. The chassis was typical GMA body, competent but not exceptional. The suspension used coil springs at all four corners, which was more sophisticated than leaf springs, but still allowed significant body roll. The steering was recirculating ball with power assist, which made it light but vague. And the brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was adequate for normal driving but marginal during sustained hard use. What made the Judge particularly dangerous was its image. This was a car that screamed performance, with its loud graphics and aggressive stance. It attracted young buyers who wanted to look fast and sometimes lacked the skills to actually drive fast. The combination of narrow power band, moderate grip, and inexperienced drivers led to a lot of crashed GTOs. The Judge also suffered from quality control issues typical of late 60s GM products. Panel fit was poor, weather sealing was inadequate, and electrical systems were unreliable. Those issues didn't make the car dangerous directly, but they contributed to an ownership experience that was often frustrating. Number 3, the 1968 Ford Mustang Cobra Jet 428. Ford's answer to the big block pony car wars was the Cobra Jet 428, and it redefined what was possible in a compact chassis. The engine was officially rated at 335 horsepower, which was the same rating Ford gave to multiple engines regardless of actual output. The Cobra Jet's real power was closer to 410 horses, with torque exceeding 440 pound-feet. Ford achieved this by taking the 428 cubic inch FE big block and improving everything that mattered for performance. Larger valves improved breathing, better exhaust manifolds reduced back pressure, and a revised camshaft improved the power curve across the rev range. The Mustang Cobra Jet could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in just over 6 seconds. But stuffing a big block into the Mustang's compact engine bay created compromises. The engine sat far forward in the chassis, which made the weight distribution heavily nose-biased. Over 60% of the car's weight was on the front axle, which caused severe understeer. Turn into a corner and the front end would plow straight ahead, pushing wide no matter how much you cranked the steering wheel. The front suspension was simple wishbones and coil springs, and it was overwhelmed by the weight. The spring rates were too soft, the shock absorbers were undersized, and the geometry wasn't optimized for the loads. The result was excessive nosedive under braking and significant body roll during cornering. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which was primitive but functional. However, the spring rates were chosen for ride comfort rather than performance, which meant the rear end would squat dramatically during hard acceleration. That weight transfer helped plant the rear tires, but it also made the front end light and vague, right when you needed steering precision. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was typical for the era. But the front heavy weight distribution meant the front brakes did most of the work, and they would fade quickly during aggressive driving. Once fade set in, stopping distances would nearly double, and the rear drums would lock up easily, sending the car into a spin. The Cobra Jet Mustang was a car that felt fast and looked aggressive, which encouraged spirited driving. But the chassis wasn't designed to handle big block power and weight, and it would bite drivers who pushed beyond its limits. Number 2, the 1969 Plymouth Barracuda, Formula S 383. Plymouth's compact pony car became a serious performance threat with the Formula S package and 383 cubic inch big block engine. The engine made 330 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. Installed in a car that weighed barely 3,200 pounds, the power-to-weight ratio was excellent, and the performance reflected it. The Barracuda could hit 60 in around 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But the compact A-body platform was never designed for big block power. The unibody structure wasn't reinforced enough to handle the twisting forces, which meant the body would flex during hard acceleration or cornering. Doors would become difficult to open, panel gaps would change, and in extreme cases, the windshield could crack from chassis flex. The front suspension used torsion bars and unequal length control arms, which was Chrysler's standard setup. But the spring rates were too soft for the big block's weight, and the front end would dive dramatically under braking. The rear suspension was leaf springs and a solid axle, with the same wheel hop problems that plagued all Mopar muscle cars. Launch hard, and the axle would wind up the leaf springs. When the tires finally broke loose, the stored energy would release violently, causing the rear end to hop and skip. The short wheelbase, just 108 inches, made weight transfer dramatic during acceleration and braking. There was no gentle progression, just sudden, violent shifts that required constant attention and quick corrections. The steering was manual, unless you ordered power assist. And even with power steering, it was heavy and slow at low speeds. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was adequate for a car this light, but fade was still a concern during sustained hard driving. What made the Formula S Barracuda truly dangerous was its size. It looked small and manageable, which gave drivers false confidence, but it had big block power and a chassis that struggled to contain it. The combination led to a lot of inexperienced drivers getting in over their heads, discovering too late that looking nimble and being controllable weren't the same thing. Number 1, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. At the top of our list sits the most extreme, most powerful, and most dangerous muscle car of the 1960s, the Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This wasn't just a high-performance option. It was a race car with license plates, built to dominate drag strips and make Chevrolet the undisputed king of straight-line performance. The ZL1 designation referred to the engine, an all-aluminum 427 cubic inch V8 that was officially rated at 430 horsepower. That number was so laughably conservative that even Chevrolet dealerships knew it was fiction. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The all-aluminum construction meant the engine weighed about 100 pounds less than the cast-iron L72 427, which improved weight distribution and handling while also reducing overall vehicle weight. The ZL1 Camaro could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at over 120 miles per hour. It could hit 60 miles per hour in under 5 seconds. Those were professional drag racing numbers, achieved in a car that was technically street legal. But everything about the ZL1 was extreme. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely made power below 3,000 RPM. The idle was violent and lumpy, shaking the entire car. The compression ratio was over 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel or at minimum high-octane premium. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would destroy itself through pre-ignition and detonation within minutes. The carburetion was a single Holley 4-barrel on an aluminum manifold, tuned for top-end power rather than drivability. Off-idle response was poor, making the car difficult to drive in traffic or at low speeds. But above 4,000 RPM, the ZL1 engine transformed into a monster that made power in amounts that should have been impossible for a naturally aspirated engine of that era. The chassis was completely overwhelmed. The first-generation Camaro's unibody structure wasn't designed for this kind of power. The suspension, coil springs up front, leaf springs, and solid axle in the rear was adequate for the base inline-six engine, but hopeless with 600 horsepower. The rear end would break loose at the slightest provocation, and catching a slide required lightning-fast reflexes and expert car control. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was standard for the era, but completely inadequate for a car this fast. Stopping from high speeds required massive distances, and fade set in after just a few hard applications. The steering was quick but not communicative, which meant you were always guessing at the limits of adhesion. What made the ZL1 Camaro truly legendary and truly dangerous was its rarity and cost. Only 69 were built, and they cost over $7,000, when a standard Camaro could be had for $2,500. That meant only serious racers and wealthy enthusiasts bought them. But even experienced drivers found the ZL1 to be a handful. The power came on so violently, the traction was so marginal, and the brakes were so inadequate that every drive was an exercise in concentration and car control. The ZL1 represented the absolute peak of 60s muscle car insanity. Maximum power in a chassis that could barely contain it, sold to anyone with enough money and courage. Today, they're worth millions and are among the most valuable muscle cars ever built. But in 1969, they were just race cars with license plates, machines that separated the skilled from the survivors and proved that sometimes Detroit built cars that were too fast for their own good. If you thought the 1960s were wild, wait until you see what came next. The 1970s pushed danger to a new level, sometimes by accident. The 1970s were supposed to be the end, the death of an era. Insurance companies wanted blood, the government wanted compliance, and the oil crisis wanted surrender. But before the lights went out on American muscle, there was one final furious decade where power and danger walked hand in hand. These weren't the refined machines of today. They were raw, unforgiving beasts that could kill you as quickly as they could thrill you. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1970s, the last warriors of a dying breed that refused to go quietly into the night. Number 12, the 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner 440 six-pack. The Roadrunner was never meant to be subtle, and the 1970 version with the 440 six-pack took that philosophy to its violent conclusion. Under the hood sat Chrysler's legendary 440 cubic inch V8, topped with 3 two-barrel carburetors that fed this beast a constant diet of high-octane fury. It churned out 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to light up those rear tires from a standstill through second gear without even trying. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, and that was with street tires that had all the grip of hockey pucks on ice. What made this car dangerous wasn't just the power, it was the chassis. Plymouth built the Roadrunner on their B-body platform, which was designed more for cruising than carving corners. The suspension was soft, the steering was slow, and the brakes were drums all around unless you ponied up for the optional front discs. That meant stopping distances were measured in football fields, not feet. The weight distribution was heavily nose forward, which made the front end plow in corners like a freight train that had missed its exit. But punch the throttle mid-turn, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The back end would step out, and you'd be sideways before your brain could process what was happening. The Roadrunner demanded respect and punished hesitation. It was a cartoon character's name on a car that could put you in a very real hospital. The triple carburetors meant tuning was a constant battle, and when one of those carbs wasn't pulling its weight, the engine would stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The six-pack setup was temperamental in cold weather, prone to flooding, and required constant adjustment to keep all 3 carburetors working in harmony. When everything was dialed in perfectly, the Roadrunner was a straight-line monster. But perfection was rare. And that unpredictability made an already dangerous car even more lethal. Number 11, the 1971 Dodge Challenger RT 440. Dodge's answer to the Mustang and Camaro was bigger, meaner, and more willing to bite than either of its competitors. The 1971 Challenger RT came with the 440 cubic inch Magnum V8 as its top engine option, pumping out 370 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. That was after the new SAE net horsepower ratings kicked in, which meant these numbers were actually conservative. This thing could move. 0 to 60 came in around 6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the low 14 seconds. But the Challenger was heavy, for 3,600 pounds, and that weight came with consequences. The steering was vague and slow, which meant you had to anticipate corners rather than react to them. Wait too long to turn in, and you'd be plowing straight into whatever was on the outside of the curve. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant companion during hard launches. Get on the power too aggressively and the rear end would skip and hop like it was trying to shake itself loose from the chassis. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially if you had the front disc option, but they still weren't up to the task of repeatedly hauling this beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fades set in quickly, and that meant your stopping distances grew longer just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Challenger dangerous was its size. It felt massive on the road, and threading it through traffic or down a narrow street required constant attention. But that massive presence made you feel invincible, right up until physics reminded you that weight and momentum are forces that don't care about your confidence level. The long hood and short deck proportions meant visibility was compromised, especially when backing up or changing lanes. You were piloting a battering ram with limited sightlines, and that made everyday driving more hazardous than it should have been. The Challenger also suffered from typical Mopar electrical gremlins, gauges that lied, warning lights that flickered, and systems that worked when they felt like it. That unreliability added another layer of danger to an already unpredictable machine. Number 10, the 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6. This was the pinnacle, the absolute peak of Chevrolet muscle before everything came crashing down. The Chevelle SS with the LS6 454 cubic inch V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. But everyone knew those numbers were lies. Conservative estimates put the real output closer to 500 horses, and dyno tests proved it. This engine was so powerful that Chevy only offered it for 1 year because it was too much, too brutal, too dangerous. The LS6 could propel the Chevelle from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds and through the quarter mile in the high 13s. Those were numbers that would still be respectable today. And this was 1970. But all that power came without any of the safety nets we take for granted now. No traction control, no stability management, no anti-lock brakes. Just you, a steering wheel, and 500 horsepower trying to kill you. The Chevelle's chassis was competent for the era, but it wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The rear suspension would squat under hard acceleration, loading the rear tires until they finally gave up and turned into smoke machines. The front end would lift, making steering light and vague right when you needed precision most. And the brakes, even with the optional front discs, were marginal at best for a car that could reach speeds where mistakes became catastrophic. What made the LS6 Chevelle truly dangerous was its accessibility. It looked like any other Chevelle on the road, which meant people underestimated it constantly. And that led to a lot of street races that ended badly, a lot of show-offs that ended in ditches, and a lot of legends about the car that was too powerful to survive. The LS6 engine was also notoriously difficult to keep in tune. The solid lifter cam required regular valve adjustments, the carburetor needed constant tweaking, and the ignition system was temperamental at best. When everything was working perfectly, the LS6 was a weapon, but perfection was fleeting, and that meant you never quite knew if you were getting full power or if the engine was going to stumble at the worst possible moment. The Cowell induction hood scoop fed cold air directly to the carburetor, which was great for power, but also meant water could get sucked into the engine during heavy rain. More than one LS6 owner learned that lesson the hard way, with a hydrolocked engine and a massive repair bill. Number 9, the 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Super Duty 455. By 1974, the muscle car era was supposed to be over, dead, buried under a mountain of emissions regulations and insurance premiums. But Pontiac had one last ace up their sleeve, the Super Duty 455. This was a 7.5-liter monster that officially made 290 horsepower. But those were the new SAE net ratings that measured power, with all accessories attached and exhaust restrictions in place. The reality was far more violent. The Super Duty 455 was an honest-to-goodness race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced the EPA to let them sell to the public. It featured forged pistons, a high-lift cam, special heads, and an attitude that said emissions regulations could go to hell. Only around 1,000 were built, which made them instant legends. The Trans Am could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, which was astonishing for a car built in the middle of the malaise era. But it was also astonishing how willing this car was to swap ends on you. The Super Duty's massive torque curve meant power was available everywhere, and that meant the rear tires were constantly on the edge of breaking loose. The chassis was the same as the standard Trans Am, which meant it wasn't really designed to handle this much thrust. The steering was slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. Get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so violently that only experienced drivers could catch it before the car was facing the wrong direction. The Super Duty Trans Am was Pontiac's middle finger to everyone who said performance was dead, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. The engine required premium fuel at a time when the gas crisis made premium hard to find and expensive to buy. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would ping and knock like it was trying to tear itself apart. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and the Rochester Quadrajet carburetor was finicky at best. This wasn't a car you could just jump in and drive. It required maintenance, attention, and a constant awareness that you were piloting something that demanded respect. Number 8, the 1970 Plymouth Hemi-Cuda. The Hemi-Cuda was the stuff of legend, even when it was new. Plymouth took their already aggressive Barracuda platform and stuffed it full of the 426 cubic inch Hemi Vate, an engine so powerful it required its own hood with a massive scoop just to clear the air cleaner. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but those numbers were as conservative as a church sermon. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses, and everyone knew it. The Hemi-Cuda could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. That was supercar territory in 1970, and Plymouth did it with an engine that was essentially a race motor, with turn signals bolted to it. But the Hemi-Cuda was dangerous precisely because it was so powerful. The chassis simply wasn't designed to handle this kind of output. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration. The front end would lift so high that steering became a suggestion rather than a command. And the brakes were woefully inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. Add in the fact that the Hemi required constant tuning, those dual 4-barrel carburetors were temperamental at best, and you had a car that could stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased, which made the car plow in corners until you lifted off the throttle. But lift mid-corner, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward, the rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting a drift whether you wanted one or not. Only about 650 Hemi-Cudas were built in 1970, which made them rare even when new. Today they're worth millions, but back then they were just dangerous street cars that separated brave drivers from survivors. The Hemi engine was also expensive to maintain. It required specialized knowledge to tune properly, and parts were expensive even when new. The dual Carter AFB carburetors needed to be synchronized perfectly, and the mechanical lifters required regular valve adjustments. The cooling system was marginal at best, which meant the Hemi ran hot in traffic and could overheat if you weren't careful. And the fuel consumption was apocalyptic. Single-digit miles per gallon was normal, which made driving a Hemi-Cuda an expensive proposition even before you factored in the inevitable speeding tickets and insurance premiums. Number 7, the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wasn't known for building muscle cars, which made the GSX all the more shocking. This was Buick's declaration that they could build something just as brutal as anything from Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet. Under the hood sat the 455 cubic inch Stage 1 V8, which officially made 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. That torque number was staggering. It was more than the Hemi, more than the LS6, more than anything else on American roads in 1970. And you felt every single pound-foot of it. The GSX could rip through the quarter mile in the high 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply refused to be denied. The steering was slow and vague, typical of GM's A-body platform, and the brakes were marginal at best. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than performance, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. But the real danger was that torque. Plant your foot and the GSX would squat on its rear suspension, load up those rear tires, and then launch forward with a violence that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The rear end would step out under hard acceleration, and correcting it required quick hands and quicker thinking. The GSX looked understated compared to cars like the Roadrunner or Challenger. It came in wild colors like Apollo White and Saturn Yellow, but the basic shape was still a Buick. That understated appearance meant people underestimated it, and that led to a lot of surprised faces and even more surprised insurance adjusters. Only about 678 GSX models were built in 1970, making them rare and valuable today. But back then, they were just Buicks that could kill you. The Stage 1 engine was built for low-end torque, which meant it pulled like a freight train from idle, but ran out of breath at higher RPM, or revolutions per minute. That power delivery encouraged drivers to keep the revs low and lean on that torque, which made it easy to overwhelm the rear tires at almost any speed. The automatic transmission was strong but shifted slowly, and there was no manual option, which meant you couldn't use the gears to help control the power delivery. Number 6. The 1971 Plymouth GTX 440 Plus 6. Plymouths had been around since the late 60s, but the 1971 version represented the last gasp of real power before emissions controls strangled everything. The top engine was the 440 Plus 6, which used 3 two-barrel carburetors to feed 485 cubic inches of angry V8. It made 385 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to make the GTX genuinely fast. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and 0 to 60 took around 6 seconds. But the GTX was big and heavy, tipping the scales at nearly 3,800 pounds. That weight meant the car had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The steering was slow, which meant you had to anticipate corners and turn in early. Wait too long and you'd understeer straight into whatever was on the outside of the turn. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially with the optional front discs, but they still struggled to haul this beast down from high speeds. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few hard applications. The real danger with the GTX was its power delivery. Those 3 carburetors meant the engine had a progressive power curve, docile at low throttle openings, violent at full throttle, and the transition between the two could be abrupt. Roll into the throttle mid-corner, and everything would be fine until the outboard carburetors kicked in. Then suddenly you'd have way more power than traction. The rear end would step out, and you'd be fighting to keep the car pointed in the right direction. The GTX was a gentleman's muscle car, refined, comfortable, and capable of genuine violence when provoked. The interior was plush by muscle car standards, with comfortable seats and a full complement of gauges. But that luxury made it easy to forget what you were driving, and that forgetfulness led to mistakes. The air grabber hood scoop was driver activated, which meant you could be cruising along peacefully and then flip a switch to feed cold air directly to those 3 hungry carburetors. The sudden power increase when the air grabber opened could catch you off guard, especially if you were already near the limits of traction. Number 5. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442W30. Oldsmobile's answer to the muscle car wars was the 442, and the W30 package turned it into something genuinely dangerous. Under the hood sat a 455 cubic inch V8 that made 370 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. That torque figure was monstrous, and it arrived low in the rev range, which meant the W30 could pull like a freight train from almost any speed. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, and 0 to 60 took just over 6 seconds. But the real story was how this car delivered its power. The 455 was smooth and linear until you buried the throttle. Then it transformed into something violent, lighting up the rear tires and sending the car hurtling forward with a force that could catch you completely off guard. The chassis was typical GM A-body, competent but not exceptional. The steering was slow and offered little feedback. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than handling, and the brakes were adequate at best. The W30 package added some stiffer springs and better shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic limitations of a platform designed for cruising, not carving corners. What made the W30 dangerous was its refinement. It didn't look or feel like a wild muscle car. The interior was plush, the ride was comfortable, and the engine was smooth at cruising speeds. But that civilized demeanor could lull you into a false sense of security. Then you'd put your foot down, the rear end would break loose, and you'd suddenly remember that this was still a car with 500 pound-feet of torque and mediocre tires. The Oldsmobile nameplate also meant that a lot of these cars ended up with older buyers who wanted performance, but weren't necessarily equipped with the skills to handle it. That combination led to more than a few expensive mistakes. The W30 came with a functional hood scoop that fed cold air to the carburetor, but it also collected water during rain, which could cause the engine to stumble. The turbo-hydromatic transmission was strong and reliable, but it shifted lazily unless you manually held gears, which most drivers never learned to do. The rear-end gearing was tall for highway cruising, which meant the car was docile at low speeds but came alive once you got moving. That split personality made it easy to underestimate the W30's capabilities, right up until you found yourself sideways on a wet road. Number 4. The 1971 Pontiac GTO Judge 455 HO. The Judge had been Pontiac's wildest GTO since 1969, and the 1971 version with the 455 HO engine was the final, furious expression of that philosophy. The 455 cubic inch V8 made 335 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque by the new SAE net ratings, but the real output significantly higher. This engine was a torque monster that could pull like a tractor from idle to redline. The Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds, but it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply couldn't be denied. The styling was deliberately outrageous. Bright colors, bold graphics, and a massive rear wing that looked like it belonged on a race car. But that aggressive appearance couldn't hide the fact that the chassis was struggling to contain all that power. The steering was slow and vague, typical of Pontiac's A-body platform, and the suspension was soft enough that body roll was dramatic in any kind of spirited driving. The brakes were marginal, especially for a car this heavy and this fast. Fades set in quickly during hard use, and stopping distances grew longer just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Judge dangerous was the disconnect between its appearance and its actual capabilities. It looked like a race car, which made drivers believe it could handle like one. But the reality was far different. This was a straight-line brute that could get loose in a hurry if you pushed it in the corners. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration, and the rear end could step out violently if you got on the power too early coming out of a turn. The Judge was Pontiac's way of going out with a bang, and it did so with style and danger in equal measure. The 1971 model year would be the last for the Judge package, and the last year you could get the big 455 engine in a GTO. Pontiac knew the end was coming, and they didn't hold anything back. The Judge came standard with a Ram Air hood scoop, but unlike earlier versions, this one wasn't functional. It was purely for show. That meant the engine was breathing through a restrictive air cleaner, which cost power, but was necessary to meet emissions standards. Still, even detuned and restricted, the 455 made enough torque to overwhelm the chassis and terrify the unprepared. Number 3. The 1970 Chevrolet Corvette LS5454. The Corvette had always been America's sports car, but the 1970 version with the LS5454 engine was more muscle car than sports car. That massive 7.4-liter V8 made 390 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the Corvette from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds. The quarter mile came in the high 30s. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with serious consequences. The Corvette's fiberglass body meant it was relatively light at around 3,300 pounds, but the chassis dynamics were primitive by modern standards. The rear suspension used a solid axle until 1963, and even the independent setup on the C3 could be unpredictable. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased because of that massive engine, which meant understeer was a constant companion. But lift off the throttle mid-corner, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose and you'd be in a drift whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick but not particularly communicative, which meant you didn't always know what the front tires were doing until it was too late. The brakes were four-wheel discs, which was better than most muscle cars of the era, but they still struggled with fade during hard use. What made the LS5 Corvette truly dangerous was its power-to-weight ratio. With nearly 400 horsepower in a relatively light chassis, this car could accelerate hard enough to surprise even experienced drivers. The rear end would break loose without much provocation, especially in the wet, and catching a slide required skill and quick reflexes. The Corvette attracted drivers who saw themselves as skilled enthusiasts, but the car had a way of exposing the difference between confidence and competence. More than a few LS5 Corvettes ended up wrapped around trees or backwards in ditches, driven by people who thought they could handle the power, but learned otherwise. The low seating position and long hood meant forward visibility was compromised, and the thick rear pillars created massive blind spots. The fiberglass body was also fragile. A minor fender bender that would barely dent a steel-bodied car could crack and shatter fiberglass, leading to expensive repairs. And because the Corvette was seen as a driver's car, a lot of people pushed it harder than they should have, learning too late that looking like a sports car and handling like one weren't the same thing. Number 2, the 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 429 Super Cobra Jet. Mercury's muscle car entry was often overlooked next to its Ford and Mopar rivals, but the Cyclone Spoiler, with the 429 Super Cobra Jet, was absolutely lethal. This engine was Ford's big block beast, a 7-liter V8 that officially made 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. But like most muscle car ratings of the era, those numbers were conservative lies designed to keep insurance companies happy. Real output was closer to 425 horses, and the torque peak was even more underrated. The Cyclone could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. It was built for NASCAR homologation, which meant the aerodynamics were actually pretty good for the era. The nose and tail were shaped to cheat the wind, and at high speeds, the Cyclone felt more planted than most muscle cars. But that didn't make it safe. The Cyclone was heavy, nearly 3,900 pounds, and that weight came with serious momentum. Once this car got moving, it wanted to keep moving in a straight line. Changing direction required planning, commitment, and a healthy respect for physics. The steering was slow and offered almost no feedback, which meant you were constantly guessing at what the front tires were doing. The suspension was tuned for high-speed oval stability, not corner carving, which meant body roll was dramatic and handling was vague. The brakes were barely adequate for normal driving, let alone for hauling this beast down from the triple-digit speeds it could easily reach. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances were measured in optimism rather than feet. What made the Cyclone Spoiler dangerous was its rarity. Because so few were built, most people had never driven one and didn't know how to handle one. That unfamiliarity, combined with massive power and mediocre chassis dynamics, led to a lot of expensive lessons. The Super Cobra jet engine was also temperamental, requiring constant tuning to keep it running right. When it was happy, it was a monster. When it wasn't, it would stumble and surge at the worst possible moments, like mid-corner when you were already on the edge of traction. The Cyclone also suffered from typical Ford build quality issues of the era. Squeaks, rattles, and trim pieces that fell off. That lack of refinement extended to the chassis, which felt loose and flexed noticeably under hard cornering. The rear leaf springs would wind up under hard acceleration, storing energy that would release violently when the tires finally broke loose. And the solid rear axle meant wheel hop was a constant problem during aggressive launches. Number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Hemi-Cuda convertible. At the top of our list sits the rarest, most dangerous, and most valuable muscle car of the 1970s, the Hemi-Cuda convertible. Only 7 of these were built in 1970, which makes them unicorns today. But back then, they were just insanely powerful convertibles that could kill you if you didn't respect what you were sitting in. Under the hood sat the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, making 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were fiction. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the Hemi's torque curve was as flat and brutal as a baseball bat to the head. The Hemi Cuda convertible could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, and this was 1970 with bias-ply tires and no electronic aids whatsoever. But add in the fact that this was a convertible, which meant the chassis had less structural rigidity than the hardtop, and you had a recipe for disaster. The body would flex under hard acceleration or during aggressive cornering, which made the handling even more unpredictable than it already was. The steering was vague, the suspension was overwhelmed, and the brakes were laughably inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. The Hemi engine required constant attention. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors needed regular tuning, and when they weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and surge. That unpredictability was dangerous when you were already trying to manage 500 horsepower through tires that had maybe half the grip of modern rubber. The convertible top also meant visibility was compromised when it was up, and wind buffeting was severe when it was down at high speeds. What made the Hemi Cuda convertible the most dangerous muscle car of the 70s was the combination of insane power, compromised structure, primitive chassis dynamics, and absolute rarity. These cars were so expensive and so rare that most owners didn't drive them hard enough to learn their limits. And when they did, the results were often catastrophic. The Hemi Cuda convertible represented the absolute peak of American muscle. Powerful, beautiful, rare, and willing to kill you without a moment's hesitation if you made a mistake. Today, they're worth millions and sit in climate-controlled garages, but back in 1970, they were street-legal race cars that demanded respect and punished anything less. This was the ultimate expression of the muscle car era's philosophy. Maximum power, in a package that expected you to be skilled enough to handle it and didn't particularly care if you weren't. The convertible top mechanism added weight and complexity, and it was prone to leaking when it rained. The rear window was plastic that yellowed and cracked over time, further compromising visibility. And because this was a convertible, the cowl shake and chassis flex were noticeable even during normal driving. Push the car hard and the entire body would twist and flex, making the handling completely unpredictable. The Hemi engine's massive weight also made the front heavy weight distribution even worse in the convertible, as there was less structure in the rear to balance things out. All of these factors combined to create a car that was breathtakingly fast, stunningly beautiful, incredibly rare, and absolutely terrifying to drive at the limit. And just when you think the 70s were the peak of chaos, the 80s slammed the door open. These next machines proved danger didn't disappear with emissions rules. It just evolved. The 1980s weren't supposed to be dangerous. Emission controls had strangled the fire out of Detroit's finest, and safety regulations had turned muscle cars into shadows of their former selves. But beneath the surface, a rebellion was brewing. Engineers found loopholes, designers pushed boundaries, and a handful of machines emerged that were faster, wilder, and more lethal than anything the government thought possible. Today, we're counting down the 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1980s, the ones that proved American power never really died. Number 12, the 1987 Buick Grand National GNX. Most people remember the 80s for neon colors and synthesizers, but Buick had something darker in mind. The Grand National GNX arrived in 1987 like a shadow with a supercharger, painted entirely in black with nothing but menacing gray accents to break the darkness. This wasn't your grandfather's Buick anymore. This was a car that could embarrass Corvettes at stoplights and make Ferrari owners question their life choices. Under that sinister hood sat a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 that most people would have laughed at on paper. 6 cylinders in a muscle car. But McLaren Performance Technologies had worked their magic, and what emerged was a beast producing 276 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers were conservative. Real-world testing showed the GNX was putting down closer to 300 horsepower, and Buick knew it. They just didn't want the insurance companies to know it too. The danger came from expectation versus reality. This was a full-size luxury coupe that weighed 3,500 pounds, riding on a chassis designed for comfort cruising, not canyon carving. But that turbocharged 6 would launch you from 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, and the quarter mile disappeared in 13.5 seconds, at just over 100 miles per hour. The problem was, the suspension and steering were designed for a different era, a softer time. Push it hard into a corner and the GNX would remind you that physics doesn't care about horsepower. The rear end wanted to come around, and the brakes weren't designed for repeated hard stops from triple-digit speeds. Only 547 GNX models were ever built, and every single one became an instant legend. But that legend came with a warning label most people ignored. Number 11, the 1982 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 Indy 500 pace car. Chevrolet wanted to celebrate their Indy 500 pace car duties in 1982, so they created a limited edition Z28 that looked fast standing still. The problem was, it had the performance to back up those looks, wrapped in a package that could bite the unprepared driver hard. This wasn't just a sticker package. This was a full-throated muscle car revival, wearing silver and blue war paint. The heart of this beast was the 5.0-liter Crossfire injected small block V8, pushing 165 horsepower through a 4-speed manual transmission. Now, compared to what came before, those numbers sound almost tame. But in 1982, this was serious power, especially when wrapped in a chassis that weighed just over 3,200 pounds. The Crossfire injection system was Chevrolet's answer to fuel efficiency regulations, using twin-throttle bodies that sat on top of the engine like something from a science fiction film. What made this Camaro dangerous was the combination of narrow tires, a solid rear axle, and enough power to overwhelm both without warning. The T-top roof configuration that most of these came with also reduced structural rigidity, meaning the car could flex and twist under hard cornering loads in ways the engineers never intended. Push it hard through a sweeper, lift off the throttle suddenly, and the back end would snap around faster than most drivers could react. The steering was slow and vague by modern standards, giving you just enough feedback to think you were in control right up until you weren't. And the quarter mile would pass in 15.5 seconds. But those numbers don't tell you about the snap oversteer or the drum brakes in the rear that would fade after one hard mountain run. 6,260 of these pace car editions rolled off the line, and they taught a generation of drivers to respect throttle control. Number 10, the 1989 Dodge Shelby Dakota. When Carroll Shelby decided to work his magic on a pickup truck, most people thought he'd lost his mind. They were wrong. The 1989 Dodge Shelby Dakota was proof that danger comes in unexpected packages, and sometimes the most lethal machines are the ones you never see coming. This wasn't a muscle car in the traditional sense, but it had more muscle car DNA than most coupes of the era, and it was far more willing to kill you if you didn't show it proper respect. Shelby stuffed a 5.9-liter V8 under the hood, rated at 175 horsepower and 270 pound-feet of torque. That engine was mated to either a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic, and the whole package sat on a shortened Dakota chassis that was never designed for this kind of abuse. The truck rode lower than stock, wore aggressive body cladding in red and silver, and looked like it meant business. And it did. This thing could run from 0 to 60 in 7.6 seconds and clear the quarter mile in 15.9 seconds at 86 miles per hour. The danger came from the fundamentals. This was a truck with a short wheelbase, rear-wheel drive, and virtually no weight over those rear wheels. Hit a wet corner with any enthusiasm, and the back end would swap ends so fast you'd think someone cut your steering linkage. The manual transmission models were especially treacherous because that V8 had enough torque to break the rear tires loose in any of the first 3 gears, even on dry pavement. Add in the fact that most buyers used these as actual trucks, loading them down with cargo that shifted the weight balance even further, and you had a recipe for disaster. Only 1,475 Shelby Dakotas were built over 2 model years, and survivors today command serious respect from anyone who understands what they're capable of. This wasn't a truck for weekend warriors. This was a machine that demanded skill, attention, and a healthy understanding that physics applies to pickups just as brutally as it applies to sports cars. Number 9, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero 2M4. The Pontiac Fiero was supposed to be GM's answer to the mid-engine sports car revolution, a fuel-efficient commuter wrapped in futuristic styling. But in 1984, Pontiac decided to drop a bigger engine in the middle of that plastic body, and the result was the 2M4, a car that looked like a Ferrari's baby brother but handled like a temperamental exotic when pushed beyond its limits. The 2M4 came with a 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, making 92 horsepower, which sounds pathetic until you remember this car weighed just over 2,500 pounds and had its engine sitting right behind the driver's head. But the real danger models were the later V6 versions, especially the 1988 GT that packed a 2.8-liter V6, making 140 horsepower. That might not sound like much, but in a mid-engine car with a short wheelbase and snap oversteer characteristics, it was more than enough to get you into serious trouble. The Fiero's danger came from its mid-engine layout, combined with cost-cutting measures that left it with suspension components borrowed from the Chevrolet Chevette and Citation, economy cars that had no business donating parts to a sports car. The weight distribution was excellent on paper, 44% front and 56% rear, but that rear weight bias meant the car would rotate aggressively if you lifted off the throttle mid-corner. Early models also suffered from engine fires due to poor cooling system design, earning the Fiero a reputation that followed it throughout its entire production run. The combination of plastic body panels that could hide accident damage, a tendency to snap into oversteer, and brakes that were marginal at best made the Fiero 2M4 a car that rewarded smooth inputs and punished aggression. And closer to 7.6 seconds for the V6 GT. But those numbers don't capture the way this car could surprise you when you thought you were driving well within its limits. More than 240,000 Fieros were built between 1984 and 1988, and they taught countless drivers that mid-engine handling isn't something you can take lightly. Number 8, the 1984 Ford Mustang S VO. Ford's Special Vehicle Operations Team had a mission in 1984, prove that a turbocharged four-cylinder could outrun a V8 and do it with style. The Mustang SVO was their answer, a high-tech muscle car that traded displacement for boost pressure and tradition for innovation. It was brilliant, it was fast, and in the wrong hands, it was absolutely treacherous. Under the hood sat a turbocharged 2.3-liter four-cylinder engine, producing 175 horsepower and 210 pound-feet of torque. That Turbo 4 was mated to a 5-speed manual transmission and backed by a sophisticated suspension system that included adjustable Coney shocks and a 4-wheel disc brake setup that was rare for the era. The SVO could run from 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds and complete the quarter mile in 15.5 seconds at 90 miles per hour. Those were respectable numbers, especially considering the fuel efficiency this thing could achieve when you kept your foot out of it. But the danger lurked in the turbo lag and the chassis dynamics. Mash the throttle at low RPM, and nothing would happen for what felt like an eternity. Then suddenly, around 3,000 RPM, all that boost would come flooding in like a tidal wave, overwhelming the rear tires and lighting them up even in third gear. The transition from docile cruiser to tire-shredding monster happened so abruptly that countless drivers found themselves sideways before they realized what had happened. The SVO also sat on relatively narrow tires for its performance capability, and the combination of turbo lag, limited rubber, and a solid rear axle meant that throttle control was absolutely critical. Lift off suddenly in a corner, and the weight transfer would unload the rear end, sending you into a spin. Stay on the power, and you'd overwhelm the tires and slide wide. The narrow window between those two outcomes required skill and experience that most buyers simply didn't have. Ford only built 9,844 SVOs over 3 model years, and the car gained a reputation as a thinking person's muscle car. Emphasis on the thinking part, because if you didn't think carefully about your inputs, the SVO would teach you an expensive lesson. Number 7, the 1982 to 85 Ford Mustang GT 5.0. When Ford reintroduced the 5.0-liter V8 to the Mustang lineup in 1982, they didn't just wake up the pony car. They unleashed something that would define street racing for the rest of the decade. The Mustang GT 5.0 became the benchmark, the king of the boulevard, and the car that launched 1,000 street races. It was also a car that could swap ends faster than you could blink if you didn't respect what that V8 could do. The early 5.0 GTs started with 157 horsepower in 1982, climbing to 175 by 1983, and hitting 210 horsepower by 1985 with the addition of fuel injection. That last number made it one of the most powerful cars you could buy from an American manufacturer in the mid-80s, and the performance reflected it. The 1985 GT could hit 60 miles per hour in just over 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14-second range at close to 100 miles per hour. For context, that was faster than most European sports cars of the era, and it cost a fraction of what those imports demanded. The danger came from the chassis struggling to keep up with the power. The Mustang rode on a platform that traced its roots back to the 1970s Fairmont, an economy sedan that was never designed for high-performance driving. The solid rear axle would hop and skip under hard acceleration, especially over bumpy surfaces, and the McPherson strut-front suspension offered minimal feedback and even less feel. The rear end wanted to come around under any provocation, lift off the throttle, hit a bump, breathe wrong. And the skinny tires of the era meant traction was always optional. Four-wheel disc brakes helped, but they weren't ventilated in the early years, and repeated hard stops would fade them faster than you could say brake failure. The Fox body Mustang's lightweight construction, around 3,000 pounds, meant that all that power had an easy time overwhelming the chassis. Thousands of young drivers learned about lift-off oversteer, weight transfer, and the importance of smooth inputs behind the wheel of a 5.0 GT, and many of them learned those lessons the hard way. But that danger was part of the appeal. This was a car that demanded respect, rewarded skill, and punished arrogance. It was pure American muscle in its most honest form. Number 6, the 1987 Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. Ford's Thunderbird had evolved from personal luxury cruiser to serious performance machine by the mid-80s, and the 1987 Turbo Coupe represented the pinnacle of that transformation. This was a car that could hang with Corvettes on a road course, embarrass BMWs in a straight line, and look sophisticated doing it. But beneath that sleek, aerodynamic body lurked a turbocharged beast that could bite hard if you pushed it beyond its considerable limits. The Turbo Coupe packed a turbocharged 2.3-liter four-cylinder, making 190 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. That Turbo 4 was backed by either a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic, and the whole package sat on a sophisticated suspension system that included independent rear suspension, a rarity for American cars in the 80s. The Turbo Coupe could accelerate from 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in 15.7 seconds at 88 miles per hour. More impressively, it could pull almost 0.85 Gs on a skid pad, which was genuine sports car territory. But all that performance came with a catch. The turbo lag was significant, creating a Jekyll and Hyde personality that could catch drivers off guard. Below 3,000 RPM, the Thunderbird felt like a luxury coupe, smooth and docile. Above that threshold with the turbo spooling up, it transformed into something aggressive and urgent. That transition could happen mid-corner, and if you weren't prepared for the sudden rush of power, you'd find yourself fighting for control as the rear end tried to overtake the front. The independent rear suspension was a blessing and a curse. It provided excellent grip and handling balance, but it also made the car's behavior more complex and less predictable than a simple solid axle setup. Snap oversteer was possible if you lifted off the throttle suddenly while cornered, and the turbo's boost could overwhelm the traction control systems that didn't exist yet. Add in the fact that this was still a large, heavy car at 3,300 pounds, and you had a machine that required finesse and understanding. The Turbo Coupe attracted driving enthusiasts who appreciated its sophistication, but it also attracted people who thought they were better drivers than they actually were. The difference between those two groups usually became apparent within the first few hard corners. Number 5. The 1987 Chevrolet Camaro, IROCZ. The International Race of Champions gave its name to one of the most iconic muscle cars of the 80s, and the 1987 Camaro IROCZ wore that badge with pride. This was the car that adorned bedroom walls, starred in television shows, and defined what American performance meant to an entire generation. It was also a car that could kill you if you didn't understand that horsepower without respect is just an express ticket to the scene of the accident. The top-spec IROC Z came with the legendary 5.7-liter L98 tuned port injection V8, producing 220 horsepower and 290 pound-feet of torque. That engine transformed the Camaro from pretender to contender, delivering 0 to 60 acceleration in 6.2 seconds and quarter-mile times in the mid-14-second range at 95 miles per hour. The tuned port injection system was cutting-edge technology for the era, using long runners to build low-end torque while maintaining high RPM power. The result was a power plant that pulled strong from idle to redline, with a soundtrack that mixed V8 thunder with electronic fuel injection precision. The danger came from the same Fox body chassis issues that plagued the Mustang, because both cars shared similar architecture and limitations. The solid rear axle would hop under hard acceleration, the rear end wanted to come around under trailing throttle, and the brakes were marginal for sustained performance driving. But the IROC Z added another layer of risk. It was faster than the Mustang, heavier at 3,400 pounds, and its long hood meant forward visibility was compromised. Teenage drivers with more confidence than skill bought these in droves, and the accident statistics reflected that enthusiasm. The combination of available power, period-correct all-season tires that prioritized rain performance over dry grip, and a chassis that demanded smooth inputs meant that the IROC-Z separated confident drivers from competent ones very quickly. The car looked aggressive with its ground effects, hood louvers, and distinctive gold wheels, and it could back up that aggressive appearance with legitimate performance. But performance without control is just velocity waiting to meet an immovable object, and the IROC-Z taught that lesson to thousands of drivers throughout the late 80s and early 90s. Survivors today are cherished examples of 80s excess, but back then, they were dangerous instruments that required respect, skill, and an understanding that looking fast and being fast are two very different things. Number 4, the 1984 Dodge Daytona Turbo Z. Dodge resurrected the Daytona nameplate in 1984 with a front-wheel drive turbocharged coupe that looked like it had been styled in a wind tunnel and engineered for the Autobahn. The Daytona Turbo Z was sleek, aggressive, and shockingly fast for a car that pulled instead of pushed. It was also one of the most dangerous cars of the decade because it handled in ways that defied the expectations of drivers raised on rear-wheel drive muscle. Under that aerodynamic hood sat a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder, producing 142 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. Later, models bumped those numbers to 174 horsepower and 200 pound-feet with intercooling and better tuning. The Turbo Z could hit 60 miles per hour in under 8 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-15-second range. Those numbers were impressive, but they told only half the story. The other half was written in torque steer, turbo lag, and front-wheel drive dynamics that could catch any driver off guard. Mash the throttle in a Daytona Turbo Z, and the steering wheel would try to tear itself out of your hands as all that turbocharged torque hit the front wheels. The car would pull to one side then the other, fighting your inputs, while the turbo spooled up and dumped even more power through tires that were already overwhelmed. In wet conditions, the Daytona became nearly undrivable at full throttle, spinning the front wheels uselessly while the car barely moved forward. But the real danger came in corners. Unlike rear-wheel drive cars that would oversteer when pushed too hard, the Daytona would understeer, plowing straight ahead, while the front tires scrubbed off speed and composure. Lift off the throttle suddenly to correct that understeer, and you'd trigger lift-off oversteer as the weight transferred forward and the light rear end tried to come around. The transition from understeer to oversteer happened so quickly that most drivers would overcorrect, creating a tank slapper that could send you into oncoming traffic or off the road entirely. The Daytona's low, wedge-shaped design also meant that forward visibility was compromised, and the pop-up headlights created aerodynamic lift at high speeds that reduced front-end grip exactly when you needed it most. This was a car that required a completely different driving technique than anything most American drivers had experienced, and the learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Dodge built the Daytona through 1993 in various forms, and while later models became more refined, that early Turbo Z remained a wild, unpredictable machine that could embarrass sports cars in a straight line, and then swap ends the moment you tried to prove you could corner as well. Number 3. The 1982 Chevrolet Corvette. The 1982 Corvette holds a unique place in automotive history as the last year of the C3 generation and a car that represented the end of an era. This wasn't the fastest Corvette ever built. It wasn't the prettiest, but it was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple performance numbers because it combined legitimate speed with handling dynamics that belonged to a different decade. Under that long, sloping hood sat a 5.7-liter L83 V8, making just 185 horsepower thanks to emission controls that strangled the life out of the Corvette's performance. But even detuned, this was still a Corvette, and it could accelerate from 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in 16.1 seconds at 83 miles per hour. The chassis, however, was essentially unchanged from 1968, meaning you were piloting 14-year-old technology at speeds that technology was never designed to handle safely. The danger came from false confidence. The Corvette badge, the aggressive styling, and the V8 rumble made drivers believe they were piloting a sophisticated sports car. They weren't. They were driving a heavy front-engined, live-axle muscle car with steering that was slower than a school bus and brakes that faded faster than a summer tan. The Corvette's fiberglass body also meant that minor accidents often resulted in significant damage, and the car's low ground clearance made it easy to damage the undercarriage on anything rougher than a parking lot. The rear weight bias of 48% front and 52% rear should have provided good handling balance, but the solid rear axle and soft suspension meant the Corvette would hop and skip over bumps, especially when accelerating hard out of corners. The T-top roof that most examples featured also reduced chassis rigidity, meaning the car would flex and twist in ways that made precise handling impossible. Push a 1982 Corvette hard, and you'd discover understeer at corner entry, followed by sudden snap oversteer if you lifted off the throttle. The transition happened with little warning and even less progressiveness, and the slow steering meant you were always behind the car's rotation, chasing the back end with insufficient lock and too much optimism. Only 6,324 Corvettes were built in 1982 because production was shut down early to prepare for the all-new C4 generation. That rarity makes survivors valuable today, but back in the 80s, this was a car that wrote checks its chassis couldn't cash. It looked like a weapon, sounded like a weapon, but handled like a compromise between performance and luxury that satisfied neither goal completely. The 1982 Corvette taught a generation of drivers that the badge on the hood doesn't guarantee competence, and that sometimes the most dangerous machine is the one that makes you think you're better than you are. Number 2, the 1987 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am GTA. Pontiac took everything they'd learned from decades of building Trans Ams and poured it into the 1987 GTA, creating a machine that was part muscle car, part Grand Tour, and entirely capable of exceeding the abilities of most drivers foolish enough to explore its limits. The GTA stood for Gran Turismo Americano, and it represented Pontiac's most serious attempt at building a world-class performance car. It succeeded. It was also one of the most dangerous vehicles of the decade. The GTA came with the same 5.7-liter L98 tuned port injection V8 as the Camaro IROC Z, producing 225 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. But Pontiac didn't stop there. They added PW 16-inch wheels, wrapped in Goodyear Eagle GT tires, four-wheel disc brakes with rear ventilation, and WS6 suspension with Delco Bilstein shocks. The GTA also featured a limited slip differential, performance exhaust, and every luxury feature Pontiac could bolt on. The result was a car that could accelerate from 0 to 60 in 6.0 seconds flat and complete the quarter mile in 14.3 seconds at 97 miles per hour while pulling 0.87 Gs on a skid pad. Those numbers made the GTA one of the fastest cars you could buy from an American manufacturer in 1987, and the performance was backed by handling that was genuinely impressive for the era. But all that performance came wrapped in a chassis that still used a solid rear axle, and no amount of sophisticated dampers could completely overcome the fundamental limitations of that design. The GTA could rotate violently if you lifted off the throttle mid-corner, and the available power was more than enough to overwhelm the rear tires in any gear below fourth. The car weighed 3,550 pounds, which was substantial, and that weight took time to change direction. The GTA rewarded smooth inputs and punished sudden corrections, but its performance envelope was so high that drivers would exceed the limits of adhesion before they realized they'd entered dangerous territory. The Recaro leather seats, premium sound system, and comprehensive digital dash made the GTA feel like a luxury car, which created a false sense of security. You'd be cruising along in comfort, then suddenly you'd be exploring the limits of grip and discovering that those limits arrived faster and less forgivingly than the comfortable interior suggested. The T-top roof that most GTAs featured also compromised chassis stiffness, allowing the car to flex in ways that made handling less predictable. Pontiac only built around 5,000 GTA models in 1987, and they represented the peak of third-generation F-body performance. But that peak was sharp and unforgiving, and the GTA taught countless drivers that sophisticated doesn't mean safe, and that sometimes the most dangerous machines are the ones that make you think you're in complete control, right up until the moment you discover you're not. Number 1. The 1984 to 86 Dodge Shelby Charger. When Carroll Shelby partnered with Dodge in the 1980s, most people expected modified Vipers or updated Daytonas. What they got instead was the Shelby Charger, a front-wheel drive turbocharged hatchback that looked like an economy car and drove like something that escaped from a racing paddock. This wasn't the most powerful car of the 80s. It wasn't the fastest, but it was the most dangerous because it combined legitimate performance with handling characteristics that were alien to American drivers and wrapped the whole package in a body that looked like it came from the rental car fleet. The Shelby Charger started life as a Dodge Omni GLH, which stood for Goes Like Hell, but Shelby took it further. Under the hood sat a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder, producing 146 horsepower and 170 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound impressive until you remember this car weighed just 2,400 pounds, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that embarrassed muscle cars twice its size. The Shelby Charger could hit 60 miles per hour in 7.8 seconds and run the quarter mile in 15.9 seconds. But those numbers don't capture the violence of the turbocharged power delivery or the way this car could rotate on its axis like a figure skater with a death wish. The danger came from every aspect of the Shelby Charger's design. It was front-wheel drive, which meant torque steer was constant and dramatic. Mash the throttle, and the steering wheel would rip left or right depending on which front tire had slightly better grip. The turbo lag meant power delivery was all or nothing. Docile one moment, overwhelming the next. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and the rear end would come around so fast you'd swear someone had greased the back tires. The Shelby Charger could transition from understeer to oversteer and back to understeer in a single corner, creating a handling balance that was less neutral and more actively trying to kill you. The brakes were marginal at best, borrowed from the economy car platform this was based on, and repeated hard stops would fade them into uselessness. The Recaro seats and Shelby badging suggested performance, but the skinny tires and basic suspension meant the car was always operating at the edge of chaos. Push it hard, and you'd discover levels of oversteer that front-wheel drive cars weren't supposed to achieve, combined with torque steer that made straight-line acceleration feel like a wrestling match with the steering wheel. The Shelby Charger also suffered from terrible rear visibility thanks to thick C-pillars, and the hatchback design meant the car was loud at highway speeds, filling the cabin with wind noise and tire roar that made long trips exhausting. But none of that mattered when you were attacking a back road, feeling the turbo spool up, fighting the torque steer, and discovering that this innocent-looking hatchback could out-corner and outrun machines that cost 5 times as much. Dodge and Shelby built around 7,500 Chargers over 3 model years, and they represented the most honest, uncompromising interpretation of performance in the 1980s. No luxury, no compromise, no forgiveness, just raw, turbocharged acceleration wrapped in a package that demanded every ounce of your attention and rewarded skill while punishing overconfidence. The Shelby Charger wasn't trying to be the fastest or the most powerful. It was trying to be pure, and in that purity, it became the most dangerous muscle car of the decade. Because when everything else had been regulated and restricted and softened for safety, the Shelby Charger arrived to remind everyone that real performance has always been dangerous, and probably always will be. But hold on, the story doesn't end in the 80s. The 1990s delivered a whole new breed of risky muscle, wrapped in modern tech that didn't always behave. The 1990s was the decade everyone thought muscle had died. Regulations had won. Safety crusaders had neutered the beasts. But in secret workshops and engineering departments across Detroit, a rebellion was brewing. The muscle car was about to return with a vengeance, meaner and faster than ever before. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1990s. Machines that proved American horsepower wasn't just alive, it was angrier than ever. These weren't your father's muscle cars. These were weapons that combined old-school brutality with modern technology, creating combinations that could thrill you one moment and terrify you the next. Number 12, 1996, Chevrolet Impala SS. The full-size sedan was supposed to be dead, killed off by SUVs and minivans. Then Chevrolet dropped the Impala SS like a bomb, proving that four doors didn't mean boring. The 1996 Impala SS arrived dressed in murdered-out black, sitting low on 17-inch wheels, looking like an unmarked police car with attitude. Under that long hood lived the LT1, a 5.7-liter V8 from the Corvette. 260 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque, pushed over 4,000 pounds with authority. 0 to 60 happened in 6.5 seconds, and the quarter-mile disappeared in the low 15-second range. The 4-speed automatic shifted aggressively, feeding power to a limited slip differential that could light up both rear tires on command. But the real danger wasn't just speed, it was anonymity. In black, with minimal badging, it looked innocent until the light turned green. The interior featured bucket seats, console shifter, and white glowing gauges. The steering wheel was thick and leather-wrapped, purposeful in ways that separated this from ordinary caprices. Chevrolet built about 41,000 across 3 years, making them special but not rare. Today, clean examples command serious money. This was the car that proved muscle could wear a suit, that four doors could deliver thrills. The Impala SS was dangerous because it looked responsible until it humiliated you. Number 11, 1991, GMC Cyclone. Sometimes the most dangerous machines make no sense on paper. GMC took a compact pickup, strapped on a turbocharger, added all-wheel drive, and created something that embarrassed Corvettes. The 1991 Cyclone shouldn't have existed, but that's exactly why it became legendary. The 4.3-liter turbocharged V6 generated 280 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. The all-wheel drive system put power down without drama. 0 to 60 happened in 4.3 seconds. 4.3 seconds in 1991 when Corvettes needed over 5. The quarter mile fell in the low 13-second range. GMC built 2,998, all black with red accents. The truck sat low on special suspension. Inside, leather seats and full gauges reminded you this wasn't a work truck. The exhaust was subdued, making surprises sweeter. The Cyclone proved muscle didn't require big displacement, that turbocharging and all-wheel drive could deliver brutality. Traditional approaches couldn't match. Today, clean examples are serious collectibles. Number 10, 1996 Pontiac Firebird Formula. While the Trans Am got attention with graphics, the Formula was the subtle killer. The 1996 Pontiac Firebird Formula delivered nearly identical performance in a cleaner package. This was Pontiac understanding that sometimes the most dangerous predator doesn't advertise. The LT1 V8 produced 305 horsepower and 335 pound-feet of torque. The 6-speed manual had short throws and mechanical precision. 0 to 60 arrived in just over 5 seconds. Quarter mile in mid-13 at over 100 miles per hour. The Formula's aerodynamic nose and functional hood scoops channeled air and reduced lift at speed. Inside, the digital dash was pure late 90s General Motors, displaying speed and RPM with pixelated graphics that somehow still looked cool. The seats were deeply bolstered, holding you firmly through aggressive cornering. The leather-wrapped steering wheel provided excellent feedback, communicating road texture and grip levels directly to your palms. The shifter for the manual transmission had a satisfying mechanical feel, each gear change accompanied by a solid snick as the synchronizers engaged. Pontiac offered the Formula in colors like bright purple metallic and polo green metallic, but the smartest buyers chose subdued shades like white, silver, or black. Without the Trans Am's cartoon graphics and aggressive body kit, the Formula looked almost innocent, like a sporty commuter car that someone took care of. Then you'd hear the exhaust note, a deep rumble at idle that rose to a mechanical scream past 4,000 RPM. and you'd know this was something special. The formula proved you didn't need a screaming chicken on your hood to run with the fastest machines on American roads. Sometimes danger comes in subtle packages. Number 9, 1992, Dodge Viper RT/10. The Dodge Viper wasn't trying to be safe or civilized. It was America's answer to European supercars, powered by an 8.0-liter V10, producing 400 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. The 1992 Viper RT/10 arrived as a roadster with no roof, no windows, no traction control, and no apologies. 0 to 60 happened in 4.6 seconds, quarter mile in high 12s. Top speed passed 160, but the terror came from no electronic safety nets, no anti-lock brakes, no traction control. The side exit exhaust could burn your leg. The interior was hostile. 2 seats, a wheel, 3 pedals, 6 gauges. The steering was unassisted, requiring genuine effort. Dodge built under 1,500 first-generation Vipers, most in Viper Red. The proportions were cartoonish. Endless hood, pushed-back cockpit, stubby tail. The exhaust was a symphony. The Viper was dangerous because it demanded respect. Snap the throttle mid-corner and the tail stepped out. But when you got it right, the experience was transcendent. This was raw, unfiltered driving, when everything else was getting softer. Number 8, 1998, Pontiac Trans Am WS6. If the formula was the subtle killer, the 1998 Pontiac Trans Am WS6 was the car that kicked down your door and announced its arrival with thunder and fury. This was the F-body at its absolute peak, right before General Motors made the inexplicable decision to kill the entire platform. The LS1 V8 had arrived, replacing the LT1, and everything about the Trans Am improved dramatically. The 5.7-liter LS1 produced 325 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, numbers that tell only part of the story. The real magic was in how that power arrived. In a smooth, relentless wave that started low and pulled all the way to redline without hesitation or flat spots. The LS1 was lighter, more compact, and more efficient than the LT1 it replaced, while also being significantly more powerful. 0 to 60 took just over 4.6 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 12-second range at speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour. The WS6 package added Ram air induction, a functional system that pulled cooler outside air through the hood scoop and into the engine, adding a few extra horsepower at wide-open throttle. More importantly, the Ram air system created an intake howl that mixed with the exhaust to produce one of the greatest automotive soundtracks of the 90s. The performance exhaust was less restrictive than standard systems, letting the LS1 breathe freely and adding a deep, aggressive rumble that announced your presence blocks before you arrived. The body kit was pure excess. Massive hood scoop, aggressive ground effects, rear spoiler. The exhaust note was unforgettable, rising to a scream as the LS1 pulled toward redline. Inside, bolstered seats and a 6-speed manual with short throws made every shift satisfying. The most iconic color was Arctic white with blue graphics. The WS6 Trans Am was raw, loud, fast, and unapologetic. Number 7, 1997, Chevrolet Corvette. The C5 Corvette arrived for 1997 as a complete reimagining. Everything was new. The LS1 produced 345 horsepower. 0 to 60 took 4.7 seconds. Quarter mile in low 13s at over 105. Top speed passed 170, making the C5 one of the fastest production cars available. The chassis used hydroform steel, lighter, and stiffer. The suspension delivered balanced handling and comfortable ride quality. 12-inch brakes could haul the Corvette down repeatedly without fade. Inside, real leather and supportive seats created an environment worthy of the performance. The hatchback provided surprising cargo space. The exhaust was sophisticated, screaming at redline. The C5 could corner with ferocity, generating numbers that embarrassed European sports cars, costing twice as much. Torch red remained the iconic color. The C5 proved American engineers could build a world-class sports car. It matched European competitors for handling, exceeded them for speed, and cost thousands less. The C5 was dangerous because it made supercar performance accessible. Number 6, 1999, Ford Mustang SVT Cobra. 1999 should have been a victory for Ford. Instead, it became a scandal. Ford claimed 320 horsepower. Tests revealed closer to 280. Ford offered buybacks and compensation. Even with the deficit, the Cobra was quick. 0 to 60 took 5.6 seconds, quarter mile in low 14. The independent rear suspension gave handling that competed with anyone's warranties. Even with the power deficit, the 99 Cobra was seriously quick. 0 to 60 took around 5.6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the low 14-second range at just over 95 miles per hour. The independent rear suspension, lifted from the Lincoln Mark 8, finally gave the Mustang handling that could compete with solid axle competitors. The suspension was tuned for performance, with stiff springs and thick anti-roll bars that controlled body roll through aggressive cornering. The brakes were massive 13-inch ventilated rotors at all four corners, far larger than anything on a base GT. They provided strong, fade-free stopping power even during repeated hard stops from high speeds. The transmission was a Tremec T, 45 5-speed manual with short throws and mechanical precision that made every gear change satisfying. The optional automatic was a 4-speed unit that shifted reasonably well, but was rarely chosen by enthusiast buyers. The Cobra wore aggressive 17-inch wheels wrapped in performance rubber that helped it corner with confidence. The body kit was subtle but effective, with a lowered stance and functional aerodynamics that reduced lift at high speeds. The hood wore a subtle bulge to clear the taller dual overhead cam engine. The rear featured a modest spoiler and unique taillights that identified the Cobra from behind. Inside, leather seats and white-faced gauges created an upscale environment that separated the Cobra from base Mustangs. The exhaust note was refined compared to pushrod competitors, lacking the raw bark of a 5.0, but offering a sophisticated mechanical precision that some enthusiasts preferred. The dual overhead cam engine revved freely and smoothly, pulling strongly from low RPM all the way to redline. The intake made its own music, a mechanical howl that added to the experience. Ford offered the 99 Cobra in colors like laser red, Atlantic green, and chrome yellow with black accents. Despite the power controversy, or perhaps because of it, the 99 Cobra laid essential groundwork for the 2000 model. Ford supercharged the 2000 Cobra as an apology, creating one of the most legendary Mustangs ever built. The 99 Cobra's legacy is complicated, but it proved Ford was committed to building genuine performance cars even when they stumbled. The danger of the 99 Cobra came from its capability despite the power deficit, and from knowing what it would become just 1 year later. Number 5, 1996 Chevrolet Corvette Grand Sport. Chevrolet built the Grand Sport to honor the legendary race cars of the 60s, those brutally fast machines that competed against Shelby Cobras and Ferrari GTOS on tracks around the world. The 1996 Corvette Grand Sport combined the base LT1 V8 with aggressive aerodynamics, wider bodywork, and exclusive colors that made it instantly recognizable and undeniably special. Only 1,000 Grand Sports were built, all of them wearing either Admiral Blue with a white stripe and red hash marks, or black with similar graphics. The LT1 produced 330 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque, the same output as the standard Corvette. But the Grand Sport wore significantly wider wheels, 11 inches in front and a massive 11.5 inches in the rear, wrapped in aggressive Goodyear Eagle GSC tires developed specifically for this application. The suspension was tuned for the wider track, with stiffer springs and dampers that controlled the extra grip. The result was a Corvette that could corner harder and faster than any C4 before it. 0 to 60 took just over 4.7 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the high 12-second range at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. But straight-line speed wasn't the point of the Grand Sport. This was about cornering capability, about generating lateral acceleration numbers that embarrassed European sports cars. The wider tires and tuned suspension allowed the Grand Sport to pull over 1.0 G in steady-state cornering, numbers that were genuinely impressive for 1996. The Grand Sport's body was pure aggression wrapped in fiberglass. Flared fenders covered the wider wheels, creating a muscular stance that looked ready to attack. The front brake cooling ducts were functional, channeling air to the massive rotors and helping prevent fade during track use. The rear featured unique taillights and graphics that honored the original Grand Sport race cars. Every detail was purposeful, from the wider rear flares to the functional cooling vents. Inside, every Grand Sport received unique embroidery on the seats, featuring the crossed flags and Grand Sport script. A numbered plaque on the console told you exactly which of the 1,000 examples you were sitting in. The rest of the interior was standard C4 Corvette, which meant comfortable leather seats, clear analog gauges, and a surprisingly spacious cockpit for a sports car. The exhaust note was classic small block Chevrolet, smooth and sophisticated at cruise, rising to a mechanical scream at wide-open throttle. The LT1 pulled strongly from low RPM and revved freely to its 6,300 RPM redline. The intake made a subtle howl that added to the mechanical symphony. The Grand Sport could corner with genuine ferocity, the wide tires and tuned suspension, allowing speeds through curves that would terrify drivers of standard Corvettes. Chevrolet offered the Grand Sport as both a coupe and convertible, though the coupe was significantly more popular with collectors and performance enthusiasts. The convertible was beautiful, but added weight and reduced rigidity, compromising the handling that made the Grand Sport special. Today, Grand Sports command serious premiums over standard C4 Corvettes, with clean examples selling for multiples of their original sticker prices. This was Chevrolet's love letter to racing heritage, wrapped in fiberglass and painted in colors that demanded attention. The Grand Sport was dangerous because it looked like art but drove like a weapon. Number 4. 1992 Dodge Stealth R/T Turbo. The Dodge Stealth R/T Turbo was the result of Chrysler's partnership with Mitsubishi, a technological showcase that proved Japanese engineering and American marketing could create something genuinely special. While the Mitsubishi 3000 GT VR4 got most of the attention from import enthusiasts, the Dodge version offered identical performance with distinctive American styling and Dodge's dealer network. The 1992 Stealth R/T Turbo was a rolling computer packed with technology that seemed lifted from science fiction. The 3.0-liter V6 featured twin turbochargers, dual overhead cams, 24 valves, and intercoolers, producing 300 horsepower and 307 pound-feet of torque. That power flowed through either a 5-speed manual transmission with short throws and precise gates, or an optional 4-speed automatic that shifted surprisingly well. The all-wheel drive system could vary power delivery between front and rear axles, maximizing traction and allowing the Stealth to put its power down without drama. 0 to 60 took exactly 5 seconds flat, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 13-second range at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. Top speed was electronically limited to 155 miles per hour, though the Stealth's aerodynamic body suggested it could go faster if unleashed. But straight-line speed was only part of the Stealth's capabilities. The technology list read like something from a concept car. The electronically controlled suspension offered sport and tour modes, adjusting damper rates at the touch of a button. Sport mode stiffened everything for aggressive driving, while tour mode softened the ride for highway cruising. The four-wheel steering system turned the rear wheels slightly at low speeds to improve maneuverability in parking lots, then turned them in the same direction as the fronts at high speeds to improve stability. Active aerodynamics included a rear spoiler that deployed automatically at speed, improving downforce and high-speed stability. The anti-lock braking system was sophisticated for the era, using 4-channel control to prevent wheel lockup during panic stops. The brake rotors were ventilated and generously sized, providing strong stopping power that resisted fade even during aggressive driving. The body was sleek and low, with pop-up headlights that were fashionable in the 90s, and a fastback roofline that looked exotic from every angle. Inside, the Stealth featured deeply bolstered leather seats that held you firmly through aggressive cornering. The gauge cluster was fully digital, displaying speed and RPM along with various system status information. Controls for the electronic suspension, all-wheel drive system, and other features were scattered across the center console. The steering wheel was leather-wrapped and thick, providing good feedback despite the power steering assist. The exhaust note was subdued compared to American V8s, almost refined, but the twin turbochargers created their own music. The rush of boost was addictive, a surge of acceleration that pushed you back in the seat and made merging onto highways effortless. The Stealth could corner with confidence, the all-wheel drive and four-wheel steering allowing speeds through curves that would overwhelm rear-drive competitors. Dodge offered the Stealth in colors like Stealth Gray Metallic and Viper Red, but the most iconic was bright white with red accents. The Stealth R/T Turbo was dangerous because it made serious performance accessible and easy. The technology compensated for driver mistakes. allowing people to drive faster than their skill levels suggested they should. This was American muscle reimagined through Japanese technology, and it worked beautifully. The Stealth proved you didn't need a big displacement V8 to deliver thrilling performance. Number 3, 1999, Pontiac Trans Am WS6 Ram Air. The 1999 Pontiac Trans Am represented the absolute pinnacle of F-body performance before General Motors made the tragic decision to kill the entire platform. This was the fourth-generation Trans Am at its finest, benefiting from years of refinement and the arrival of the magnificent LS1 V8. The WS6 package with Ram air induction was the ultimate expression, combining brutal straight-line speed with surprisingly capable handling. The 5.7-liter LS1 with Ram air induction produced 325 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers undersell the experience. The LS1 delivered power in a smooth, relentless wave that started at idle and pulled all the way to redline without hesitation. 0 to 60 took just 4.4 seconds, a time that embarrassed Corvettes and shocked owners of European sports cars. The quarter-mile passed in the high 12-second range at trap speeds approaching 115 miles per hour. The WS6 package included functional Ram air induction that pulled cooler outside air through the massive hood scoop and directly into the intake manifold. The cooler air was denser, allowing the engine to make slightly more power at wide-open throttle. More importantly, the Ram air system created an intake howl that mixed with the aggressive exhaust to produce one of the greatest automotive soundtracks ever created. The performance exhaust featured low restriction and high flow, letting the LS1 breathe freely and producing a deep rumble that rose to a mechanical scream under full acceleration. The suspension was track-ready out of the box, with stiff springs and thick anti-roll bars that controlled body roll through aggressive cornering. The shocks were tuned for performance, keeping the tires planted even over rough pavement. The steering was quick and responsive, making the Trans Am feel smaller and more agile than its 3,500-pound curb weight suggested. The brakes were massive, with large ventilated rotors that could handle repeated stops from triple-digit speeds without fade. The body kit was pure late 90s excess and absolutely perfect for the Trans Am. The hood scoop was enormous and completely functional. The ground effects hugged the pavement, creating a low, menacing stance. The rear spoiler looked fast, even when the car was parked. The Trans Am rode on 16-inch wheels, but they were wide and wrapped in sticky Goodyear rubber, developed specifically for the F-body platform. The wheels filled the flared fenders perfectly, creating proportions that looked aggressive and purposeful. Inside, deeply bolstered bucket seats held you firmly through hard cornering. The leather-wrapped steering wheel provided excellent feedback, communicating road texture and grip levels directly to your palms. The shifter for the 6-speed manual transmission had short, mechanical throws that made every gear change satisfying and precise. The gauge cluster was clear and easy to read, with a large tachometer that swept clockwise as the LS1 climbed toward redline. The optional monsoon sound system was surprisingly good, though most enthusiasts preferred to enjoy the mechanical symphony of the engine and exhaust. Pontiac offered the Trans Am in colors like bright metallic blue and firethorn red metallic, but the most iconic combination was Arctic white with blue graphics. This color scheme was a direct callback to the Trans Ams of the 70s, and it looked absolutely perfect on the aggressive fourth-generation body. The danger of the 99 Trans Am WS6 came from how accessible its performance was. The power arrived smoothly and predictably, making it easy to get in over your head before you realized how fast you were actually going. The rear tires could break loose suddenly if you were too aggressive with the throttle mid-corner, sending the tail sliding wide in a drift that required quick hands and calm nerves to catch and control. But when you got it right, when you learned to work with the Trans Am instead of fighting it, the experience was absolutely intoxicating. This was Pontiac's final statement in the muscle car world, the last great F-body, before General Motors pulled the plug on the entire program. The 99 Trans Am WS6 was raw, loud, fast, powerful, and absolutely unapologetic about any of it. It was muscle car purity, distilled into a package that could run with anything on American roads. The Trans Am proved that old-school V8 muscle wasn't dead, it was just getting started. Number 2, 2000 Ford Mustang SV T-Cobra R. Ford built the 2000 Cobra R as both an apology and a declaration of war. After the horsepower scandal of 1999, the special vehicle team knew they had to rebuild trust and prove they could deliver on their promises. They created a Cobra that exceeded every expectation, a barely civilized race car with license plates that remains the deadliest factory Mustang ever built in the 20th century. Only 300 Cobra Rs were produced, every single one painted in performance red, every single one equipped with a manual transmission, and none of them with rear seats or air conditioning. This wasn't a compromise or a comfortable grand touring machine. This was a weapon built specifically for track days and racing, sold to approved buyers who had to sign agreements, promising not to immediately flip the car for profit. The 5.4-liter dual overhead cam V8 was a destroked version of the modular engine, built for high RPM performance and producing 385 horsepower, along with 385 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers don't sound overwhelming by modern standards, until you remember the Cobra R weighed hundreds of pounds less than a standard Mustang GT. Ford removed everything unnecessary. The rear seats, the air conditioning, sound deadening, even the radio. Every pound saved made the Cobra R faster and more responsive. 0 to 60 took just 4.4 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the low 13-second range at trap speeds approaching 110 miles per hour. Top speed stretched past 170 miles per hour, though the Cobra R was built for road courses rather than straight-line top speed runs. The real story was how the Cobra R could lap a circuit, combining brutal acceleration with genuine cornering capability that embarrassed cars costing twice as much. The suspension was pure racing hardware wearing street car camouflage. Bilstein monotube shocks provided precise damping control. Eibach springs were stiff enough to keep the body flat through high-speed corners. Massive anti-roll bars controlled body roll and kept the tires planted. The result was a Mustang that felt glued to the pavement, responding instantly to steering inputs and maintaining composure even at the limits of adhesion. The brakes were enormous Brembo units, with 13-inch ventilated rotors at all four corners and 4 piston calipers up front. They could haul the Cobra R down from triple-digit speeds repeatedly without fade, essential for track use where braking zones arrive quickly and demand total confidence. The wheels were 18-inch BBS units, lightweight and strong, wrapped in Goodyear Eagle F1, racing rubber developed specifically for the Cobra R. The aerodynamics were functional rather than decorative. The front splitter reduced lift and increased downforce on the front axle. Side skirts smoothed airflow along the body. The massive rear wing generated real downforce on the rear axle, improving high-speed stability and allowing higher cornering speeds. Every element was tested and proven, not just bolted on for appearance. The exhaust note was mechanical and angry, the dual overhead cam V8 screaming toward its 7,000 RPM redline, with a sound that was more race car than street machine. The Tremec T56 6-speed manual transmission had short, notchy throws that required commitment and precision. The clutch was heavy, demanding leg strength and making traffic jams exhausting. Every control felt purpose-built and race-focused, from the thick steering wheel to the deeply bolstered Recaro seats. Inside, the stripped interior made the Cobra R's intentions clear. The rear seat area was empty, covered by a carpeted panel. The front seats were racing buckets that held you firmly through cornering forces that would throw passengers around in standard Mustangs. The gauge cluster was clear and easy to read, with large analog dials for speed and RPM. The shift knob was a simple leather-wrapped sphere, short and positioned perfectly for quick gear changes. Ford sold each Cobra R for $54,995, a significant premium over standard Cobras, but reasonable given the hand-built nature and limited production. Today, clean examples command well over $100,000 at auction, and they're considered among the most collectible modern Mustangs ever produced. The 2000 Cobra R proved Ford could build a world-class performance car when they stopped worrying about comfort and focused entirely on speed and capability. This was the Mustang that proved muscle wasn't dead. It was just getting warmed up for a new century. Number 1. 1999 Chevrolet Corvette Fixed Roof Coupe. The most dangerous muscle car of the 1990s wasn't the loudest or the most powerful. It was the Corvette that combined genuine supercar performance with everyday usability and a price tag that seemed almost reasonable. The 1999 Chevrolet Corvette Fixed Roof Coupe, or FRC, was Chevrolet's parts bin special, combining the lightweight structure of the convertible with a fixed hardtop and the uprated drivetrain from the Z06 package. The LS1 V8 produced 345 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, the same output as other 99 Corvettes. But the fixed-roof coupe was significantly lighter than the standard coupe, shedding weight through the elimination of the Targa top mechanism and associated structural reinforcements. The result was a Corvette that weighed just over 3,200 pounds, making it the lightest C5 variant and giving it the best power-to-weight ratio of any Corvette that year. 0 to 60 took just 4.4 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the low 12-second range at speeds exceeding 115 miles per hour. Top speed stretched past 175 miles per hour, making the fixed-roof coupe one of the fastest production cars available at any price. But the straight-line speed was only part of the story. The fixed-roof coupe's lightweight structure and stiff chassis made it the best-handling Corvette of the C5 generation. The suspension used transverse leaf springs front and rear, a Corvette tradition with completely modern geometry that delivered balanced handling and surprising ride quality. The shocks were tuned specifically for the fixed-roof coupe's lighter weight, providing excellent control without beating you to death on rough pavement. The steering was quick and communicative, with excellent feedback about what the front tires were doing. The result was a Corvette that felt alive and responsive, eager to change direction and stable at very high speeds. The brakes were massive 12-inch ventilated rotors at all four corners, with improved pads that provided strong, fade-free stopping power. The anti-lock system used sophisticated 4-channel control to prevent wheel lockup during panic stops. The traction control system could be completely disabled for track use, allowing experienced drivers to explore the limits without electronic intervention. The fixed-roof coupe wore unique body-colored headlight surrounds and came standard with the thin-spoke lightweight wheels from the Z06 package. The result was a Corvette that looked purposeful and aggressive without any unnecessary decoration. The aerodynamics were excellent, with a low drag coefficient that helped the LS1 push the Corvette through air efficiently, even at sustained high speeds. Inside, the fixed-roof coupe received the same high-quality interior as other C5 Corvettes. Real leather covered the seats and door panels. The seats themselves were supportive and comfortable, even on long drives. The gauge cluster was clear and easy to read, with large analog dials for speed and RPM, surrounded by smaller gauges for oil pressure, coolant temperature, and fuel level. The center console housed controls for the climate control system and optional heads-up display that projected speed and RPM information onto the windshield. The exhaust note was sophisticated and mechanical, a deep rumble at idle that rose to a screaming crescendo as the LS1 climbed toward its 6,000 RPM redline. The intake made its own music, a mechanical howl that added to the symphony. The 6-speed manual transmission had short throws and precise gates, making every gear change a tactile pleasure. The clutch was reasonably light, making the fixed-roof coupe surprisingly easy to drive in traffic despite its performance capabilities. The fixed-roof coupe could corner with genuine ferocity. The lightweight structure and stiff chassis allowed the suspension to work more effectively, keeping the tires planted through fast sweepers and tight hairpins. The steering feedback was excellent, communicating exactly what the front tires were doing and allowing precise placement on track. The balanced weight distribution meant the fixed-roof coupe rotated naturally through corners, neither pushing wide nor snapping into oversteer. Chevrolet offered the fixed-roof coupe in a full range of colors, from Arctic white to magnetic red to navy blue metallic. The most popular color was black, which emphasized the fixed-roof coupe's aggressive proportions and made it look like a stealth weapon. Production numbers were limited, making the fixed-roof coupe relatively rare compared to standard coupes and convertibles. The danger of the fixed-roof coupe came from how capable it was, how easily it could reach speeds that would terrify you in lesser cars. The performance arrived smoothly and predictably, making it easy to get in over your head before you realized how fast you were actually traveling. But the fixed-roof coupe also provided the tools to handle that speed. Strong brakes, responsive steering, and a balanced chassis that stayed composed even at the limits. The 1999 Corvette fixed-roof coupe was the most dangerous muscle car of the 90s because it made supercar performance accessible and easy. It could run with Ferraris and Porsches on track, then cruise home comfortably on the highway. It could embarrass exotic cars costing 3 times as much, then park at the grocery store without drama. This was Chevrolet proving that American engineering could deliver world-class performance in a package that made sense financially and practically. The fixed-roof coupe was the perfect expression of 1990s muscle, fast, capable, and absolutely deadly in the right hands. The 1990s proved that muscle never really died. It just evolved and adapted to a changing world. These 12 machines weren't just transportation. They were weapons wrapped in fiberglass and steel. powered by engines that roared defiance at everyone who said American performance was finished. From turbocharged trucks to stripped-out race cars, wearing license plates, these machines proved horsepower and heritage were alive and well. Some could embarrass exotics in straight lines. Others could carve road courses with precision. All of them could thrill you one moment and terrify you the next. Which of these dangerous legends would you take for one last drive down an empty back road? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories from the era when American muscle came roaring back to life, hit that subscribe button for more. The best stories are always just beginning.